So let's begin. Tomorrow marks the Day of Remembrance. It is the 79th commemoration of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signing of Executive Order 9066, a decree put forth in 1942 that forced most people of Japanese descent, as well as some Germans and some Italians, from their homes into incarceration camps during World War II. Focused on the Western states other than Hawaii, a total of 120,000 people of Japanese descent, 2/3 of them American citizens, and 40,000 of them children. All these people were affected, including my father and his family, who were sent to these camps. So I thought today was only appropriate to have Bradford Pearson talk about his book, The Eagles of Heart Mountain. While Brad will be joining us in a bit, first I want to introduce a friend of mine, Nancy Ukai. She's a journalist, and in addition to her career, which included a stint with Newsweek magazine, Nancy has dedicated her life to shining light on Japanese American history projects, most recently through a national parks funded project called 50objects.org. So welcome, Nancy Ukai.
Oops, hi. Thank you very much, Michael, for having me. And I'm really honored to be here. My name is Nancy Ukai, and I'm in Berkeley, California. As Michael said, tomorrow marks the 79th anniversary of the day that Franklin Roosevelt signed this presidential order. And it resulted actually in 12 of my relatives, my parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, being taken away from their homes in Berkeley and Oakland. So our project is called 50 Objects, and it's a history website. And what we decided to do was curate a collection of 50 artifacts and explore the history, the material history of that thing, and also the lives of the people most closely connected to it. So our current project, our current object and its story is the 20th in our episodes or our installments. And this is actually a pot that was made by hand for a bonsai plant in the desert of northeastern California at the Tule Lake Camp. And the man was an immigrant and made these pots when he was in his mid-30s. He was a grocery man from Sacramento. But I'd like to tell you how I met Michael. He actually was collaborated on a story that we did on his father's wooden sandals, which are, as you can see, wooden clogs, and they're just quite amazing. As you can see, there's a painting of Mickey Mouse, and these were made in 1940 or so, 1941 or two probably. It says New Mexico, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and his grandfather was incarcerated in a Department of Justice camp as an alien enemy, and his crime was to probably be teaching martial arts, which were considered to be a threat to the United States. Is that true, Michael? Do you want to tell us a little bit about these?
Yes, it actually is true. Thank you, Nancy. It's my grandfather was a Japanese language instructor at 3 different schools, as well as he was instrumental in helping bring Kendo to the United States. And through a tip from a University of California professor, the FBI, a Japanese American university professor, the FBI arrested him and took him away from my father, his brothers, and my grandmother, and they were separated for 2 years at a Department of Justice enemy alien camp in New Mexico. First it was Santa Fe, and then it was Lordsburg, New Mexico, and the family was separated for 2 years. And they were reunited in 1944 at Crystal City, Texas, which is another different camp. It was a Department of Justice camp that had Germans, Italians, South Americans, and they were used as pawns to be a prisoner of war exchange with Axis countries. So they're reunited in 1944, and everything was supposed to be happy and hunky-dory, but unfortunately my grandmother passed away 2 months after the war ended in Crystal City Camp. So that's a little bit of story of my family. And the geta was something that my grandfather made for my father, who kept it and didn't tell any of his children. And they somehow, when he had passed away 5 years ago, we were cleaning his house and we saw these. And what are we going to do with these? So we decided we heard Noriko Sanafuji from the Smithsonian Institution. They were looking for artifacts, especially for children's artifacts. So we donated them to the Smithsonian. And Goro's little famous shoes ended up being in the Smithsonian for 2 years.
Can you show them again on the screen? I just
Sure.
love for people to be able to see this kind of vintage Mickey Mouse that your grandfather painted on the slippers for your father, who was like 7 or 8. And at the time, Mickey Mouse wasn't new, but certainly an international character. So known in Japan, certainly known in the United States. And, I'm so glad that you were able to save them after your father died. And the bottom, you can see a little bit of rubber. I think that might have come, we think, from a tire or something, little tread.
Yes.
Yeah.
On the bottom is a little bit tire tread.
Yeah. But the people at the Smithsonian were saying it's just one of their really favorite artifacts in the collection, which is really saying something because there are millions of things. But this, the Japanese shoe, it's handmade by an incarcerated grandfather for his child who's in a camp hundreds of miles away. So it's very poignant. And then there's another interesting connection in your family artifact collection. Is there a photograph of your uncle Mamoru?
Oh, yes. One moment here.
These stories just end up bringing in, of course, any stories, like I'm sure any of the viewers, you have things in your home, which if you were to ask your relatives about, many stories would come out that you weren't aware of. So this is a photograph of Michael's uncle. Do you want to, and this person here, Mamoru Takeuchi, who signed it, age 7, son of Shingo Takeuchi. Mike, do you want to read it? Because it's your relative.
My name is Mamoru Takeuchi. My father has not did anything bad against the United States. He came to the United States long ago. My mother has a weak heart. Will you please let my father come home?
So this photograph was taken, in February. Excuse me, the letter was written in February, but the photograph was actually taken 2 years before, when Mamoru put on a little military uniform just as he was being rounded up and taken to an army camp. And you can see his family ID tag put on there. The photograph was taken by Dorothea Lang, who was a government photographer at the time. And thanks to her, there are these indelible images which preserve the history. So Michael, thank you so much for cooperating with our project. And I invite the viewers to visit our website. We have 30 more stories to go. And some of the things that we've done in the past include a gold watch, a child's doll, a braille board made by a man who lost his sight at Heart Mountain. And another thing that's coming up is a wooden home plate that was for a baseball field in Arizona for sports fans. So thank you so much for having me.
Nancy, thank you, and ganbatte kudasai.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So now we turn our attention to tonight's featured speaker, Bradford Pearson. Bradford Pearson is former features editor of Southwest, the magazine. He has written for the New York Times, Esquire, Time, and Salon, among many other publications. He grew up in Hyde Park, New York, which is the same as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and now lives in Philadelphia. The Eagles of Heart Mountain is his first book. Please welcome Brad Pearson.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you, Brad, and congratulations on the book. It's quite incredible.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Before we get into talking about the book, I want to mention something that happened in your past. It was a seminal moment in your life. When you were just out of college, you were kidnapped at gunpoint by three men. If you can explain to people what had happened.
Sure. So the spring of my senior year in college, I was walking to my car one night here in Philadelphia, and I was approached and kidnapped by three young men. Kidnapped overnight, mock executed in an abandoned lot, and sort of abandoned. And I ended up a few years later, I ended up writing about this for Philadelphia Magazine here in Philly. And Michael and I were talking a little bit before the event started about what I did for the story was I eventually reached out to some of the men who had kidnapped me, and I visited them in prison. And we talked about our lives. We talked about what our lives have been since that night. And like you said, Michael, it was a really seminal moment for me, not only as a person, but as a writer in terms of trying to figure out sort of my point of view and how my story fits into a wider world.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think why I wanted you to bring that up is this. Your book is very meticulously reported, but it also has a lot of empathy in it. And at the end, after this happened, the fact that you went to visit, you met up with two of your assailants and captors a few years later and actually kind of befriended them, which is kind of unheard of for a lot of people. But I think it has to do with a lot of your personality and maybe your machinations as a journalist. Would you say that's kind of true?
Yeah, I guess that's really nice of you to say. And it's actually interesting that you should bring that up, because when I first started, we'll probably get into this, but when I first started thinking about the Eagles of Heart Mountain and started thinking the story, I reached out to the daughter of Babe Nomura, who's one of the main characters in the book. And she told me recently that one of the reasons that she thought that I was trustworthy and would be a good person for telling her dad's story was actually that she had read my kidnapping story as well, and sort of made that same connection that you just made in terms of empathy. And I don't know, it's kind of a weird thing to say, that personally pat myself on the back and say that I'm an empathetic person, but I guess if a couple other people are saying that it's a through line in my work that I've never really recognized before, it's nice. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all you. George Takei, the activist, actor, and writer, he once in an interview told me that even the most educated people don't really know about the variety of stories of what happened during the internment incarceration era. In California here, most people assume that everyone was in Manzanar, or cringing here, they called it Manzanita or even marzipan or whatever. But just about everybody outside of historians in the Japanese community, have a very limited scope on what Japanese and Japanese Americans went through during this time. And in reality, December 7th or even February 19th was just the action. December 7th, much of this happened prior to World War II. Much of the seeds of internment and what was going on with Japanese Americans and Japanese was going on in California and wherever prior to World War II. And you wrote extensively about that. And I was wondering why you wanted to write so much about what happened in the decades prior to World War II.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, that what George Takei has said is, it rang true for me when I first started doing all my research for the book. Was even going back to when I originally found this story of the Eagles, was when I was at the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center I was on a separate reporting trip in 2013, and I saw this very small line about the Heart Mountain Eagles on one of the displays. And, it sort of lodged in my head, but I remember leaving the interpretive center that afternoon and thinking how embarrassed I was by how little I knew about this topic of in American history. So when I set out to write the book, I knew that if I, as someone who was a history minor in college and loved history, knew so little about this chapter in US history, that meant that the average reader, the average American, probably knew even less than I did. So for me, it was trying to not necessarily correct the historical record, because the research and all of the facts are there, but put them out for the reader to say, yes, Pearl Harbor happened, but Pearl Harbor was basically the event that allowed all of these other entities and groups to finally get what they wanted, which was to get the Japanese Americans and the Issei out of California and Washington and Oregon. And that was, a collection of farmers and ranchers and just run-of-the-mill racists who didn't want Japanese and Japanese Americans to be in, whether it was LA County or Kent County or wherever it was, or Multnomah County, whatever county these Japanese Americans were living in. Pearl Harbor just gave them that final fuel to say, okay, now we can finally get back this farmland that has been obviously improved by Japanese American hands for the past few decades. And not only could do that, we can get it up for pennies on the dollar. So for me, it was important to give that whole history. And it also, when I was writing, I realized that while the book's main characters are teenagers, their stories are really the stories of their parents, the stories of the Issei generation who came to America and set forth and set this new path for Nikkei around the world. And, so whether it was Babe's parents or Horse's parents or Kichi Ikeda's, whoever it was, when their parents came, what their parents did sort of helped guide who they became as a Nisei generation in the 30s and 40s.
Interesting. You mentioned Babe and Horse, who are the two main characters of the story. Horse, of course, is George Yoshinaga, who's a pretty famous journalist with Japanese Americans, especially if you get the Rafu Shimpo. I mean, if you read The Horse's Mouth. And Babe was like Jim Thorpe, I would think, would be the most accurate comparison to an athlete. And, George was from Northern California, from a farm area, and Babe was from Hollywood. And it's really interesting how they got together. But if you can talk, they were already passed away by the time that you had started working on the book. So how were you able to gather that information about George, Babe, and the other players as well?
Yeah, I mean, I owe a lot to the folks at the Heart Mountain Archives and Densho in Seattle, who have these great collections of, not only historic documents and objects, but also a great oral history collection. A lot of what I got from George Osanaga was from a very long oral history that he did probably about maybe in the early 2000s, I want to say. And so it was later in life, but he remained sharp for so long that his memories were still really there. So it was a lot of oral histories. And then it was also interviews. So I was lucky enough to be able to interview and speak with Horse's children, and then Babe's children and his widow. I was able to talk with Stan Igawa's sister, which was great. And lots of different people, lots of different family members from various families. I was able to speak with them as well, which was really nice. And it's funny because depending on who I would speak with, everybody had a different perspective. So speaking to someone's widow, you get one perspective of who they were when they were in their 20s, when they first met. And then in another situation, I spoke with Stanigawa's sister, and there's some insight there that only a sister can give you about their brother. And then you speak to children, and they have, most kids have, no matter who you are, have a pretty rosy depiction of your parents, especially if they've passed away, thinking back, even if, maybe they were irascible or whatever, as when you were a teenager, you still look back, hopefully a lot of folks look back fondly on their parents. So the interviewing process was a lot different for every kind of person that I would interview. And then a lot of the other research about babe and horse was from the Heart Mountain Sentinel newspaper. So all of the camps had some variety of a newspaper, but the Heart Mountain Sentinel was really above and beyond, and was much. It was a professional operation. Bill Hosokawa ran it, who was a newspaperman before the war, and then went and worked at the Denver Post and the Des Moines Register, and lots of really great newspapers after the war. So you had a really high-end operation there that was putting out a weekly paper that was, as good of a newspaper as I could expect to be produced out of a camp. And that was, I got a lot of information there, not only about football stuff, but about camp life. And then there was also a high school newspaper that I was able to sort of dissect a little bit and get a sense of some of the players' personalities and who they sort of fell and where they fell in the hierarchy of high school, which was really interesting.
How did you find all this treasure trove of information? I mean, where were the newspapers kept? And
yeah, so the newspapers, any of us can look them up right now. The Library of Congress actually has every copy of the Heart Mountain Sentinel digitized, and so do Densho via Heart Mountain. So there's a lot of opportunities there to see the Heart Mountain Sentinel and to be able to read that. Densho has all of the oral histories, not only digitized, but searchable in PDFs and Word documents. So I was able to pull all those and use those. And pretty early on in the process, actually, there's a guy at Heart Mountain named Bacon Sakatani who kind of goes by Mr. Heart Mountain and really was really a driving force in getting the interpretive center and getting Heart Mountain recognized in the various ways that it has. And when I first started pulling at the threads of this, somebody had said, you need to reach out to Bacon. And Bacon has every copy of the Sentinel and the high school newspaper, and he'll mail it to you. So I got a CD in the mail one day with, every issue from August 1942 through the summer of 45, or the early fall of 45. And
wow.
then I just started reading every one. So I read every issue of it, and I read every issue of the high school paper from front to back, and that was before I'd put any words down on paper. I knew that I really needed to understand what this camp was, not just the football team of the camp and these characters, but what what everyday life was like at the camp, or what were the sort of workaday issues that they were having, whether it was problems at the latrines, or there was a coal shortage, or the police staff, or food issues. So I really needed to know everything about Heart Mountain. And a lot of that came from the Sentinel, but then it also came from folks like Mike Mackey out in Heart Mountain, who have dedicated a lot of their lives to just really commemorating and researching this story and putting it down in book form and putting it down in interviews that, this book was only possible because of all the other people from 1942 until 2018, when I started working on it, that have also done all of this work that I was able to really lean on, in addition to the interviews and research that I did.
Wow. In addition, I mean, you were really thorough when talking about Heart Mountain, but also I have to add that you were really thorough when talking about Santa Anita, the process assembly center. And I got a clearer picture, I think, more than any other publication I've read about Santa Anita. And how did you get the information about Santa Anita? I should ask you.
Yeah, I was able to find a few of the FBI reports about Santa Anita. First of all, what life was like at Santa Anita, but then also pull the FBI reports about the uprising at Santa Anita, which unfortunately is sort of mentioned in some other books. But every time I would read another book, I would say, I really want to know more about this uprising, because, as you and Nancy know, so much of the story of Japanese American incarceration has been told from, the perspective of Shikata Ganai. It can't be helped. And here's, why this happened. But when I first heard about that uprising at Santa Anita, I said, that doesn't really line up with the narrative that this was some sort of passive events that Japanese Americans just let happen to them. So once I started thinking about that, and then I found the FBI reports, that's when I knew that I wanted to sort of pull on those threads of resistance and rebellion within the camps. Even, in the history chapter, I even reached back a little bit further into some of the farmer uprisings in Japan and in the sugarcane fields in Hawaii to talk about how this was not a culture that, and maybe it's just my perspective coming from the outside, but it's, presented in a much more passive way than I think history actually bears out. So a lot of the Santa Anita stuff was from, Carrie McWilliams, who wrote about the Japanese American incarceration in the 40s and 50s, wrote a bit about Santa Anita, and he was there as a sort of an observer, I believe, for the American Red Cross or LA County. I can't remember it right now. But his notes, he was pretty left-leaning. So his notes on that are very clear-eyed in terms of what he was seeing there and the injustices that were being presented, even in the temporary camps, never mind what was to come at Heart Mountain or Manzanar or Tule Lake or wherever everyone was heading to after Santa Anita.
If I could segue really quick back to what you're talking about, the labor issues, I really like the fact that you mentioned Ventura County and Coastal Borough Baba was, when you had 500 Japanese people unionized with 200 Mexican people, I thought at the turn of the century, there's a cemetery out in Oxnard that marks those graves. And I thought it's really interesting that you did that. It shows how much research you put in. But back to Santa Anita, you did have a passage that I'd like you to read from. So if you have a moment, we can talk a little bit about Santa Anita and then get back to Heart Mountain here.
Yeah, so this is a passage in a chapter that's essentially just about Santa Anita and which was at the time was sort of a temporary way station for folks, mostly from Los Angeles County before they were sent to the more permanent camps. Although at the time when they were sent there, nobody really knew at all what was about to happen, even the officials. So this is actually a passage about the opening of Santa Anita, the racetrack, and then it transitions into the arrival of Japanese Americans in 1942. On Christmas Day, 1934, a brown mare named Las Palmas crossed the finish line at Santa Anita Park, the first horse in 25 years to win a race in California. 40,000 visitors left their stockings on the chimney and packed the tiered grandstand for the park's grand opening. Crowds 100 deep waited to feed their coins into the totalizator, a new machine tasked with collecting bets, determining odds, and then broadcasting the victories and defeats to the wager-holding crowd. And $100,000 electronic camera timer was installed for the opening. Accurate to 1,000th of a second, the machine emitted a light beam that, when crossed by the first horse out of the gate, triggered a camera. Pictures were again taken at the furlong mark and at the finish. In a feat of modernity, those photos were then developed within 3 minutes. With that, the photo finish, a now ubiquitous event and expression, was born. Despite the winter sun driving temperatures into the mid-70s, women beneath the cantilevered roof donned fox-trimmed coats and magenta-dyed ostrich feather blouses. Another draped a knee-length cape trimmed with gray caracol atop her wool suit. A hunter green hat with fresh orchids rested on her head. Pelts of leopard and gold ermine roosted across the woman's shoulders, while thousands of alpine sports hats topped the men. Quote, the women's feathers were brighter, longer, and much more saucy, tilting into the air, Los Angeles Times fashion editor Sylvia Weather reported. Oliver Hardy and Will Rogers were two of the hundreds of Hollywood stars on hand. Ignoring the depths of the Depression, bettors that day wagered $259,000, close to $5 million today. Built in an architectural combination of staid colonial revival and aerodynamic curves of the streamlined modern style of Art Deco, the part offered the first six-figure prize in horse racing history, and its stables could house 1,000 horses. On that first Christmas, $5 million worth of horses stood on the premise. No expenses were spared. It was rumored that funds were so low on opening day that there was no money left to make change at the concession stands. Stars like Bing Crosby and Al Jolson were part owners, while the park's proximity to Hollywood, it sat less than 20 miles east of the boulevard, assured that silver screen icons like Cary Grant, Betty Grable, Lana Turner, and Jane Russell also became regulars later in the decade. The grandstand faced a panorama of dusty green San Gabriel Mountains, powdered with a topping of snow. From there, the physics seemed impossible. Miles of flat, undeveloped California land, abruptly changing course and turning 6, 8, 10,000 feet toward the sky. the vista would travel the world on postcards. On March 27th, 1942, Santa Anita Assembly Center welcomed its first prisoner. Field artillery battalions weighed heavy with full belts of live ammunition met them at the gate. Some prisoners wept, others, too dazed to comprehend their fate, just walked by the troops, bewildered. Of the 15 racetracks, fairgrounds, and expo centers the United States government used as temporary camps, Santa Anita squeezed nearly twice as many people, nearly 19,000, into its stables, barracks, and grandstands as the next largest center. For some, it is a vacation filled with recreational pursuits and splashed with gay exchanges of visits to neighboring barracks, wrote the Los Examiner. To others, it is an idle period spent in stolid contemplation of the future. This is Japanita. They were greeted by a bronze statue of the legendary horse Seabiscuit, and reminders of the track's previous and future lives were hard to miss. The driveway in front of the camp showers was named after champion two-miler Malicious, the bridle path after Triple Crown winner Gallant Fox, and the service barracks fronted on Seabiscuit Lane. The alphabetical avenues ran from Azukar to Your Honor. Some incarcerees had the distinction of living on Man-O-War Avenue, named after the 20th century's top thoroughbred. While the names and statues served as a reminder of their new location, there was another more pervasive reminder: the smell. The first 7,182 incarcerees were herded into stables, the next 11,411 into the 500 barracks constructed in the track's parking lot. The stables, which held horses just weeks before, were bleached, the equine smell mixing with ammonia in the spring sun. Workers removed and replaced 14 inches of dirt from each stable, but it was little help. 8 years of horse urine and feces soaked into the wood, scenting the makeshift rooms. Each person was handed a mattress cover and pointed toward a pile of straw with which to stuff their bedding. In an effort to raise the mood, everyone who lived in the stables claimed to occupy the stall that housed Seabiscuit.
Wow. You painted quite a contrast from what Santa Anita was to what it became. This beautiful sport of kings, into this prison camp, makeshift prison camp. But what I like the fact that you wrote that is later on, you kind of reversed it a little bit when you talk about football in the middle of camp. I mean, my uncle Tego, who was a dancer, I think I talked to you a little bit about, learned to dance in camp, and he performed kabuki dance in front of hundreds of people. But that was like a Japanese cultural thing. Football is an American thing. It's not baseball, the national pastime, but Japan had a long association with baseball. Football was new to the Japanese culture. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you came, how football became interesting, the interesting central point of the story.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head in that it's, baseball grew up on parallel tracks to the United States and Japan. So when the Issei generation first came to the United States, baseball, even though we consider it the national pastime now in the United States, it wasn't this foreign game. It wasn't a foreign concept to the Issei generation. Whereas football was something that had never really breached outside of the US barriers at that point. So for me, that was part of what made this story so interesting, was that there was this group of Japanese American teenagers in, sort of what we think of now as like the definitive American sport, the sport that is still, the majority of professional and college athletes are still from America. It's not like basketball or baseball where there's these international leagues and international recruiting. Most football players are still Americans. So even, and that was obviously much more true in 1942. So when I saw this and I thought about who these teenagers were as Americans, there were Americans of Japanese descent that were teenagers who had all the same interests that any other teenager would have in the fall of 1941. And that meant that some of them played football. The numbers were obviously a lot smaller than those who played baseball or basketball. But it was, that sort of jumped out at me and said, like, let me do some more research on this. And there's a great professor, Joel Franks, who's done a lot of research on Asian Americans in football. and written extensively about this. And his research I leaned heavily on, especially looking back at the history of this and looking back at Issei groups who, when they first got here, they saw this game and said, okay, well, let's try to figure out how to play this. And, started leagues in Seattle and Vancouver and the Bay Area, and started playing against immigrant teams from Chinese teams of Chinese immigrants, and then eventually sort of worked their way up into playing white teams too. I mean, worked their way up in the considering that it was the 1910s from a perspective standpoint. But and then once the Nisei generation starts coming around, the first kids start trickling onto teams in LA and San Francisco in the 20s. And then there's a few more kids that play in the 30s. But then even by the early 40s, there's still, not large amounts of kids. Babe was the only Japanese American player on the Hollywood team, and Hollywood didn't lack for Japanese Americans in general. They had a Japanese American student club in the high school itself. So there were players there, there were kids there, but Babe especially was just such a extraordinary, and I mean, in a lot of ways, a once in a generation athlete that I think he had excelled so much in the Nisei Athletic Union baseball, basketball, and softball leagues that football just seemed like the next step for an incredible athlete. And I think, like you said before, like Jim Thorpe's a great example of that, where any sport that Babe picked up, he was going to be great at. And later in life, he became a great golfer. There's all these, there's these some athletes that you have that you just think they're just an athlete. So if you give them a basketball, if you give them a baseball, if you gave them a pair of skates and a hockey stick, they're going to figure it out. And, and the Eagles were lucky that they had Babe, because Babe sort of was not only their best player, but he was also the person that I think everybody, including the coaches, sort of leaned on in terms of figuring out how we're going to turn all these other kids in Wyoming into a team. And that was really, I think, a secondary role for Babe at Heart Mountain in terms of just being, in addition to just being the best player.
Yeah, he did a lot of coaching, didn't he, with them, and they had to change a lot of things on the fly, yet they were a good team.
Yeah.
How are they a good team?
Yeah. I think, and it's interesting. It's a way that all of us sort of get good at whatever it is that we do, where we find a certain advantage that we have that our opponent doesn't, and we use it to our advantage. And I think that, when the first practice was held, 3 of the 40 kids who tried out for the Eagles had ever played high school football. So you think about that and you think, okay, well, how do you take that and how do you end up with an end result of being, especially that first season, an undefeated season? And the kids at Heart Mountain and the coaching staff realize, okay, we're much smaller than all these teams in Wyoming and Montana. So what does that also mean? Okay, we're quicker, we're easier to get through the line. We're not we're not huge, so we can like split through the defense. And it also means that we're not going to get tired as easily. So we're going to run a really fast offense. And especially back then, players played both sides of the ball. So they played offense and defense. So if you had smaller guys who are quicker, who are in better shape and aren't lugging 220 pounds around the field, then they're going to be able to get back on defense quicker, and they're going to be able to play offense better. And I think that a lot of that first season, a lot of the Eagles' success was really based on the fact that they were running this quick system that people in Wyoming and Montana just hadn't seen before. They took a lot of lessons from playing on the West Coast, and one of their coaches had played at Los Angeles City College, a guy who they sort of, I'm not sure if it was from adoration or not, called him Tubby. But he played at LA City College and sort of understood the how to run an offense and how to run plays in a way that played to the Eagles' strength.
Wow. And it's worth mentioning that not only were they undefeated, they were unscored upon, correct? That first season in all their games.
Yeah, that is correct. And I think that, again, that has a lot to do with the fact that they just weren't as tired on defense as some other folks and on some other teams were. And there was some luck to it. And, assume that having 5,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans
Yeah.
lining the field probably had a lot to do with it too. And I get into it a little bit in the book, but probably not as much as in hindsight, maybe I would have if, whenever you write anything, you read it again later and you think, oh, I wish I had done this a little bit differently. But, I just think about these kids from these white high schools where they're from towns of 500 or 2,000 people showing up at this Heart Mountain Camp, which at the time it was open was the third largest city in the state of Wyoming. So all of a sudden you're in with 11,000, 12,000 people. And some of these kids had probably never seen a Japanese or Japanese American person in their life. And all of a sudden they're playing on this dirt field covered in stones. And there's 5,000 Japanese American faces lining the field, 8, 10 people deep. I think that must have been pretty intimidating, quote stadium to walk into.
Yeah. It's Tom Brokaw, the NBC newsman, who's also a big supporter of the Heart Mountain Visitor Center. He said in a video that sport is a defining way of how we feel about ourselves. And it seemed like having that for not only the team, but having that for the camp, it seemed to uplift. It wasn't just an entertainment thing, but it was a source of pride. And if you speak to that, how it affected the rest of the camp, have this team be so successful.
Yeah, I think even before the team success, you saw that as soon as the camp opened in 42, they built a baseball diamond. They scraped an area and put in a football field. And pretty quickly, they built sumo wrestling rings. And they did things where they just said, okay, this is our way of life. And we're going to push the WRA as far as possible to be able to accommodate these things that we know will bring us some sort of joy and solace, even though we're in, a camp 1,000 miles away from home in a climate that none of us have ever lived in before. But then, once the Eagles started playing, I think you saw the effect they had on it. And I don't want to put too much on the Sentinel, but, every time the Eagles would play, they'd have a gamer from the previous week's game. They'd have a forecast of the upcoming week's game. They'd have the box score. They'd have the lineup. They would have a column written about the previous week's game and the upcoming week's game.
Wow.
What the practices were like. So there were times where I would be reading a Sentinel and there would be 5 separate stories about the football team in that week's edition. So you saw pretty quickly how important this was, not just the day of, not just watching the games, but what, the only thing that rivaled the football team in terms of its weekly interest was, at least, in the Sentinel, was the resistance movement in the camp, which came later on. But there's also a double-edged sword too to that commitment to the team, which is that by the third game, the columnist was sort of excoriating the team for not practicing enough and not focusing enough during practice. He said it was a really sloppy game. There were a lot of penalties, and this is, lack of focus. And I think, I'm not Japanese American, but I think that there's some overlap in terms of that sort of a cultural overlap that the columnist was applying to the football team, if I can be blunt.
So in addition to the season, you documented there's a lot of dissents. There was a lot of resistance and rebellion, which, football is the main focus of your story, but you also expanded upon everything that was going on. And if you could address that a little bit about what was going on toward the end of the war, and in terms of people, were they willing to be drafted? Were they willing to fight for the United States?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of that was that football is a fall sport. So I wanted to find ways. So when you talk about, I really appreciate that you mentioned how much I focus on other parts of the camp too, because I wanted to give sort of this holistic view of what these teenagers were going through. So whether that was on the football field or in high school or on their work details or whatever it was. And it just so happened that when I was doing my research, I realized that every time that the football season would end, that the draft resistance movement in the camps sort of picked up. So in the last third of the book, maybe the second half of the book, it sort of becomes this back and forth where you're learning about the football team, but then at the same time, I'll step back. The background to that is that the U.S. Army, ever since the camps opened, were sort of begging the WRA and the federal government to let Japanese Americans fight in the war. So Japanese Americans had been classified technically as aliens right after Pearl Harbor, which meant that they were ineligible for the draft. So even if a Japanese American wanted to join the war effort, which many did, they were barred from it because they were technically not in that moment really considered Americans, which is a whole other moral and ethical argument that we could spend a whole other hour talking about. But then in, by 42, 43, the Army starts to try to have volunteers, and they send a recruiter to Heart Mountain. And I think at that time, there were about 3,000 draft eligible men, and they left with 37 recruits. So, and a lot of that was because pretty quickly a draft resistance movement and volunteer resistance movement started in Heart Mountain, where it's basically said, hey, a lot of us would be willing to join the Army. A lot of us would like to. We want to defend the country that we were born in, that we are a part of, but we'd also like you to classify us as Americans and, answer some basic questions. What are you going to do about our families? What are we going to do if we're on leave? Do we have to come back to camp? And the U.S. government couldn't answer those questions. So the volunteer numbers were very low. And then the next year in 44, they basically said, okay, no, you're just going to get drafted. And that was when the draft resistance movement really kicked off at Heart Mountain and then spread to all of the other camps to varying degrees. And at Heart Mountain, it led to dozens of men resisting the draft and then being tried and convicted in federal court in a trial that at the time was the largest mass trial in Wyoming state history. So you have, for me, it made sense for these two stories, not only to live together in the book because it's about Heart Mountain, but it's also because the players on the Eagles are the people that are having to make these decisions. So when you're 17, 18 years old, you're the people who are having to decide, okay, what do I do here? Do I join the Army? Do I skip my physical? Do I resist? Or do I do something in between where I can, hopefully I don't get drafted or, and all these kids, all the Eagles are having to deal with this. And you had players who were leaving to do their draft physicals, after the game on Friday or Saturday, they would go get their draft physical and they would come back to practice as a private. And then you had other folks who went, not to give too much away, but you had folks who went and then were deemed ineligible because of physical defects, despite the fact that they were incredible athletes. And then you have folks who just straight up said, no, I'm not going to do this, and were convicted and sent to federal prison. So I thought that it was important to show, if I was going to show how good this team was on the field, I also wanted to show what these guys and what these kids were really having to deal with emotionally and mentally when it came to the draft too, and the decisions that they're having to make for not only for themselves, but for the honor of their families and how their families were going to be viewed, not only at camp, but by America writ large.
Interesting. How many times did you go to Heart Mountain? Did you make the physical trip? And when you did, were you able to just imagine what was going on, at the time?
Yeah, I've been to Heart Mountain 4 times, I think. So, and a lot of that is, I would, every year after I started working on it, I started thinking about the book, I would go to the Heart Mountain pilgrimage every July. And that was really helpful, not only from a research and reporting standpoint, but it was also helpful in terms of understanding this Heart Mountain community and the kind of people that I was writing about. And it also kind of, it put a pit in my stomach thinking, okay, I need to do this right. Like, I can't screw this up. This isn't my story. This isn't my family's story. This isn't, I'm not Japanese American. This isn't my culture. So these people are welcoming me into their lives, their family lives, the Heart Mountain community, and the broader Japanese American community. So all those trips were centering in a lot of ways, but they were also kind of made me nervous. And I think some of those nerves helped in terms of research and having to say, okay, I need to get every single bit of this right, fact checking, and really just sort of saying, really hoping that I nailed the story and got it right from a cultural standpoint, an emotional standpoint, a factual standpoint. And to your original question, what I would do every time during one of these pilgrimages is that, there's hundreds and hundreds of people there, but every year I would leave the group. Sometimes I would do it at night by myself. I would drive back out to camp. Sometimes I would do it early in the morning, and sometimes I would do it when there are lots of people around. But I would always walk out off of the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center's property and walk out into the fields now that are owned by farmers that used to be the camp, and sort of stand there and walk around and look up at the mountain and think, what was this like? I'm here in the middle of summer. What was this like when it's -12 and there's snow coming in through here? And I'd always just, whether I was out there for 10 minutes or an hour or an hour and a half, I would just walk the property and just think to myself, what was this? And how can I capture that in an honest way? And when you get really far out in parts of Wyoming, the thing that you're always struck by is just how quiet it is and just how you can't hear anything. And for me, that was, again, pretty centering, and just thinking, and it allowed me just to really think and try to put myself in a teenager's shoes. And that was part of what this made this story so universal to me, was that we've all been teenagers. Most of the people who have read this book are older than the main characters are. So we've all experienced what teenage life is like. And imagining what teenage life must be like when you're 16 and you live in Hollywood, or you're 16 and you live on a strawberry farm in Mountain View, and you get that American life of yours ripped away and you get sent to this camp. So that was a lot of the universality of the story, is what really appealed to me to begin with, and then especially as I was writing it and researching it.
Well, you wrote a run back, 100-yard touchdown run back of a book.
Oh, that's really kind. Thank you.
Yeah. Brad, thank you very much for joining us. Nancy, thank you as well. And thank you everyone for joining us, and tell your friends to please buy Brad's book. Show the book, Eagles of Heart Mountain. And if anybody wants to watch this will be available on our YouTube channel. So thank you everyone for joining us. Brad, Nancy, thank you.
Thank you both for having me. I really appreciate it.
Good night, everyone.